Welcome to the Not Sorry Art Podcast. I'm Sari, the artist and creator behind Not Sorry Art. I'm so excited to talk art and creativity with you, so grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's dive in. I also wanted to say that today's episode is sponsored by my book. I have a book coming out. I'm so proud of this, guys. The links are already up. I'll have them in the show notes. But the book is called Modern Still Life, From Fruit Bowls to Disco Balls. It is my take on a step-by-step painting book. I am really excited about it. Not only does it have like motivational tips and tricks to keep you going in your practice, but it also has clear and beautiful and full color breakdowns of the step-by-step process in my paintings. So I could not be more excited about it. If you wanted to check it out, pre-order it. It would help me more than you even know. Hello, welcome to the Not Sorry Art Podcast. I'm Sari. Thanks for being here. Today's episode, as I'm sure you can tell by the title, is Do You Need Art School to Be an Artist? And before we jump in, I'll just start by answering that short and sweet right at the top. No, you do not. Thank you for listening. You can leave a review at the... Okay, I'm kidding. I wanted to expand on this question a little bit because as many times as I know that I have said it over and over on social media, as many times as many respected curators who are very plugged into the art sphere online have said over and over, and as many times as many self-taught artists have said over and over, you do not need to have an art degree to be a working artist in this day and age. People are still really insecure about it. You know, I just got done teaching a retreat, which was so incredibly fun. And a question that I got from many people who inevitably sort of recant their own arts education is, well, do I need an arts education? And I will say, like, that insecurity to some degree doesn't go away. You know, within the context of studio art, you only have two kind of basic degree options for studio art specifically. And that is an undergrad, a BFA, and then also a master's of fine art. Your master's is your terminal degree. You cannot get a PhD. Now, I'm sure someone out there is like, there's an exception. Generally speaking, you cannot get a PhD in studio art. You can get a PhD in something and make art about it, of course. Curation, very specific things, art history, of course. But studio art, you top out at an MFA. But even still, I'll have people who they are working artists, they have bachelors, and they even still, they'll say and they'll think, well, do I need a master's to be a real artist? And I think it speaks more to the sort of ethos of the art world, that there's always a bit of an insecurity. I think a lot of it has to do with humans are just insecure creatures, particularly people who are drawn to the arts, in my humble opinion. I'm speaking, maybe just projecting from my own experiences, but we're an insecure crew and we're sensitive, and the art world is very, very, very subjective. I come from a world that's way, way objective. So if you've listened to this podcast at any length, you know that I was a cross-country runner in high school and college, you know, at a pretty competitive level. And there are tons of parallels, you know, pushing yourself, having a practice, etc. But the thing that I always use as sort of a counter whenever I'm thinking about anything art world related or my career related is I compare it to kind of what it looked like to be a runner. And, you know, there's nothing more objective, in my opinion, than a foot race, right? Here's the start line, here's the finish line, and here's your time, right? Down to the millisecond. And so there weren't long conversations about people's experience. You know, I started running kind of earnestly halfway through high school. I didn't run in middle school really at all. And, you know, I didn't go to fancy camps. I didn't have special summer programs. I was pretty bare bones. You know, I ran during my track season kind of runner. But when I finished a race, and I had finished with people who had been running since they were in 5th grade and who went to summer camps and clinicals and did all this extra training, trained out at Flagstaff, even, you know, Arizona at altitude, that wasn't relevant when you went necessarily to the starting line, and certainly by the time you finished a race. No matter if you didn't train in your off season and you were just some ungodly prodigy, not common, but whatever, or you trained and you had the best pedigree, you went to the nicest clinicals and camps, it didn't matter because your time was your time was your time, and there was such a level of objectivism. Is that a word? It was such an objective, you know, field that people didn't really worry about pedigree. You were who you were when you showed up, right? You know, sports people could kind of muse about that, but it was definitely an afterthought, where I feel like because of how subjective the art world is, what is good, what is bad, even if you paint super amazing photo representational, amazing process, so skilled, whatever, people are still going to think you're bad and lazy. Like I've heard that on social media plenty of times where, people who are ex-professors from RISD will hop on the internet and say, if you paint representationally, you're lazy and your art is bad. Not even hyperbolic right there. So what are you to do? Where is the objective, good and bad within the art world? There isn't one. There is very little true consensus, and there's very little objectivity. And so because of that, I think it just creates a world where you breed insecurity. We live in a hierarchical system, culture at large, and between all of those things sort of coming together, people are, insecure. And so this is probably one of my longer intros, but without further ado, I'm going to talk to you about why you don't necessarily need art school. What do you need? Because it's not that you need nothing, right? Unfortunately, fortunately, however you want to view it, you cannot just wander in off the streets for the most part, make art good or bad, subjective, whatever, and necessarily get an art career. There are things you have to do. And I would say another point to quickly make is that the art world is big. If you sell a painting to your Uncle Joe, congratulations, you're an artist and you are operating within the art world. The art world kind of gets used a lot. But I suppose to be clear, what I'm talking about with the art world is the circuit of galleries and, all the way up to like high-end blue chip galleries down to like, smaller regional galleries. It's a very close-knit world. Gallery owners speak to each other. Curators know each other. It's all things considered a small world. That is kind of what I'm speaking to when I speak to the art world. I've been on the internet long enough. I've talked about these things long enough that I have said something about the art world and someone will have an exception. And then you have to say, is that within the art world or without the art world? I'm not making those arguments. But assuming that gallery representation is something you consider integral to the art world, that's kind of what I'm speaking to. And ultimately, I'm going to bring this around to why I teach. And why do I teach representationally? It's definitely not representational art, making, painting, drawing, whatever. It's definitely not the darling of the moment. In fact, I would say faux naive tends to be the way to go. Conceptual, which is fine. I'm not saying you'll get my whole spiel, but one is not better than the other. But why would I teach? Why would I spend my time, energy teaching representational painting? If there's a big debate around whether or not that's good art making, and what does that have to do with a lot of people who do graduate with undergrad degrees and even masters a handful of times without those technical representational painting skills? Why would they come to someone like me and want to learn those skills? We're going to talk about all of that today. So if that sounds interesting, we'll just jump into the episode. Okay, I'm going to start by talking about the benefits of going to art school, because I am very passionate that you do not need a traditional arts education to be an artist, but I always feel remiss if I don't sort of begin with why I think it's valuable and why I think ultimately art education, maybe even higher ed, should be considered more of a right. I know, I've had this debate enough in real life. I know not everyone agrees with me, but I personally believe that it should be, you have a right to continuing education in some capacity. And I'm very pro education. I think institutions specifically can be great, and I certainly learned an enormous amount from my undergraduate. I went to kind of a poorly funded school system, kindergarten through senior year. And I didn't take a lot of art classes on top of that. I sort of chose like choir as my creative fine arts credit. And so, between those things and the fact that I think obligatory fine arts education ended in like middle school for me, I didn't have a lot of arts background. I was a doodler. I liked art history. But outside of some PBS specials and, notebooks full of scribbles, there really wasn't much of an arts education for me. So whenever I did go to school and I took my art history 101, 102 courses, whenever I took my foundations of design and took conceptual art courses and started to write my artist statement, there was an enormous amount of growth that happened there that if I hadn't had, I don't think I would, at least not as early as I did, have the skills to be able to pursue a more traditional art career. I think even the idea of learning to write an artist statement, which is what I would say most studio art programs have in common with each other, because they can vary. I learned how to talk about my artwork, and I translated that to a massive amount of my strategy on social media. I was having a hard time getting into galleries. I was, younger, newer, all kinds of extenuating circumstances made it to where that was not really something that I excelled in, especially in the beginning. And so I just sort of said, listen, I have an audience, humble as it was in my first few years, and I will just tell them what I usually talk about in my artist statements. And that was incredibly helpful. I think it laid the groundwork and the tone at which I treated my own art, which was really helpful, because when you start making art, a lot of times you don't always know about these distinctions between design art and fine art. I would argue that the line between those is getting a little bit fuzzy, which is a good thing. I think it reminds me similarly of the sort of distinction between craft and fine art, which has largely been critiqued in a way where, yes, because it's ties to classism and, racism and all of those things, like there's still resistance around accepting fiber arts and craft. But within the higher echelons of the art world, it almost has cultural currency to it, because there have been enough introspective conversations around why is there a line, and does it have to do with sexism and classism and racism. So, in that way, I think we're heading towards something similar when it comes to the distinction between design art. Now, what is the distinction, in case you're listening and you've never heard that concept, which fair, which I get. Design art is sort of like you're making art just to be a wall hanging, versus like fine art, which is more about having a conversation. And speaking again in very general terms, it could warrant its own podcast, truly. Another thing that art school helped me to do was develop media literacy. I think personally, art is nothing else if not a certain amount of media literacy. Why are we looking at what we're looking at? Who is the intended audience? What is the messaging? How is it relevant to the current time period? What is it responding to? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that whenever people say arts education is important, a lot of times people who maybe aren't so keen on that idea, the resistance is like, well, why would you need to learn to paint? It's such a useless skill. And I get it. And I think that doesn't come from a place of malice. I grew up in the Ozarks with a lot of people who think like that. I think the idea more is, listen, if you can't pay your bills, who cares if you can paint? We should get people skills that'll help them feed themselves. So I really don't think, I don't harbor a lot of resentment towards middle Americans, especially those who've been exploited. But there is kind of a bit of a culture war thing there. But I would say where the meaningful advantage to taking art classes in elementary school and middle school and high school, and maybe even beyond as sort of a requirement, is that you become a lot harder to be manipulated by the media whenever you can have those conversations because you've taken enough art classes. Who cares if you can draw or paint or have color theory? If you sort of understand how to gauge a piece of media, I think that becomes an incredibly valuable skill. And I would say with my arts degree, where I didn't have much media literacy, I grew up with skeptical Gen Xers, so there was a kernel of that in there. But college really helped solidify for me. I don't think it should wait until college. I think it should be something we taught much younger. But on my own personal journey, I would consider that an incredibly valuable skill that I learned when I was in my undergrad. And ultimately, the most valuable thing that I earned in my undergrad was permission to call myself an artist, which I would like to remind you here, you possess everything you need to give yourself the permission to call yourself an artist. I hear over and over, and I even think it in my own self, even this many years later, of like, well, when will I be a real artist? And it's a really tricky subject, and I totally get it. When, okay, I'm an artist, but I'm not a real artist. And I will say that, unless you sort of address the inner insecurity that so many of us are carrying around, that goalpost will always move. I very fortunate, very lucky, very privileged that I can support my family largely on my artist income. And even still, you're not a real artist because I, sell to the masses or don't have as many gallery shows as I'd like, that sort of game will trick itself on me. I sympathize and I understand where someone who maybe doesn't have that no one handed you a diploma that said Bachelor's of Art, where that insecurity would come from. And I think for me, I didn't have the certainly the confidence in my early 20s to be able to sort of call myself an artist had not it been for the fact that I was in art classes my entirety of my undergrad. And I had an amazing painting professor who kind of gave us this talk and basically said, like, you're an artist because you're making art. That's the end of story. It doesn't matter if you have a degree. It doesn't matter if you drop out. It doesn't matter if you're an art minor. It doesn't matter if you're taking just painting as a credit. Like, you're making art. You're having a conversation. You've learned the language of visual picture making. Congratulations, you're an artist. It was the most valuable thing that I maybe got from art school, but it's also the thing that you don't need to pay for and you can sort of self-ordain. But I wanted to make this a podcast episode and not a cheeky little Instagram message, because I think as much as it is nice to hear you're an artist if you say you're an artist, but I also know that if I just sort of insisted that you're an artist if you say you're an artist, and then the art landscape being what it currently is, where there is hierarchy, and it does matter, some things, networking, connections, do you live in a big city, name it. I mean, any of those things could be their own podcast episode where we sort of explore those. But to say, hey, you're an artist if you say you're an artist, and then look at the very limited landscape of who is a working artist, there's all kinds of great Pew Research data that shows that, like, for every $10,000 a year extra your family of origin makes, you're, I think, 10% more likely to become an artist. I'll look up that data for you guys. And if your family makes $1 million a year or more as your family of origin, you're hundreds of percent more likely than the average person to be an artist. You can say anyone's an artist if you want to be an artist, but then you'd have to grapple with, well, are only wealthy, predominantly white, predominantly city-based people the only ones who want to be artists? And so I think it's disingenuous to sort of leave people with that and then not say, well, what does help someone become a, quote, real artist? And I think the thing I always tell my students is a lot of it is self-awareness. A lot of it's the ability to maybe not necessarily write, but certainly to understand and be able to communicate an artist statement. And I wanted to start by talking about insider versus outsider art. It's also sometimes referred to as naive art. I will say that there is currently a bit of a debate around the semantics of how we describe that, because a lot of that has been tied to sort of classism and ableism, and it's its own, again, could be its own podcast. What I will say is that if you look at the media landscape prior to the internet, for example, who had access to those conversations around what is artwork, media literacy, how to break down a visual, how to talk about your art, sort of the cultural canon, certainly in regards to art history, contemporary, modern, working backwards, who would have had access to that? Most people would have had to have gone to some sort of arts education, whether that was just in high school or certainly through college, certainly through a master's. And everyone on the outside, there was a lot more of a distinction between who has access to all of that education versus who does not have access to that. You could, read all you want, but it just wasn't readily available. And I would say with the internet, but even more specifically with social media, that line has been blurred. I think with the internet, first of all, now you have access to tutorials, more expansive tutorials. You get more artist interviews. You get more access to art education. I binge art history YouTube videos, and I've learned more about art history, compulsively consuming that in the last decade than I did in my art history classes in college. Not that those weren't valuable, but I'm learning the same kind of stuff. I'm contextualizing it, whatever, right? If you are someone who's very self-motivated to learn, then you can continue to learn. But I would really harp on the idea that social media has made a big dent in it, largely because you can ask an artist, you can ask a working artist, like, what are you doing? What is your artist statement? You can more readily see the applications for gallery openings, and you can see and interact with curators. The amount of times I have gone in depth and read Ask a Curator interviews and Q&As over the years, and it's been so enlightening. In fact, a lot more enlightening than I even got in my undergrad. I had a great undergrad program. You just learn a lot of information. Art is meant to be a lifelong kind of study, and you can only learn so much in 4 years, even with good education. I learned so much about what current contemporary art is doing, who it's responding to, just from social media. Which brings me to probably the biggest, in bold distinction, which is nowadays the distinction between insider and outsider art has less to do with your proximity to that education and more with, are you engaging with the current conversations happening in contemporary art? And do you have an understanding of art history enough to sort of position yourself as an artist in a way that you're continuing that conversation? I was taught in art school that art, the function of it is basically to continue sort of a larger cultural conversation in some way. It doesn't have to be the deepest thing in the world. It could just be, I am exploring the way light hits lighthouses. And the thing that differentiates someone from your grandma who's just painting lighthouses in Maine and gifting it to people, which is a totally valid form of art. I'm not putting it down in any way. But versus someone who could make that exact same body of work but show it in a gallery is usually just self-awareness and the ability to position yourself in that larger conversation. So the questions you would ask yourself basically would be in your artist statement. Who are you responding to? Why is it unique that you're making it? What is it about your personal identity or lived experience that shapes the way you see these? Again, it doesn't have to be the deepest thing, but your ability as an artist to write an artist statement where you can display self-awareness as well as an understanding of the landscape, the current art world landscape, who are the contemporaries, what are they saying? That's the distinguishing factor. It really does, in my personal opinion, largely come down to that. Now, of course, I have to say that how far does that self-awareness go? How far does that knowledge of art history go? Well, it is all filtered through where you sort of sit in the current hierarchy. Not in any way to say that if you're rural and you grew up poor and you don't fit what the typical sort of successful artist looks like, that you cannot be an artist. On the contrary, my personal sort of philosophy around it is the more you don't look like the contemporary art world, the more you should have your voice elevated, in my opinion. But we know, unfortunately, that's not how the world works. And so, you have to be aware that those art elements, all of those intersecting things might make it harder for you in some ways, and there are more and more programs that sort of set out to sort of fix those inequalities, of course. But that's kind of what you're up against. And the more you can sort of display your self-awareness within that context, the more I think you're in a position to be able to be a, quote, real artist, or, like I said earlier, engaging with the current conversations in the contemporary art world. Note that I did not say you have to have an art degree. I will say this, nothing cemented this idea for me more than whenever I worked as a curator. So, I've done a few times where I have been the curator for, let's say, an online women's art registry. Women, non-binary people who don't identify as a male will, apply with their art to a registry, and I had to select, 50 out of, a few hundred people out of that, or online art exhibition or an in-person art exhibition. I've been lucky enough to do a few of those, and they're really fun. And, because I tend to be very egalitarian at my core, I always sort of suspected you don't need an art degree, that it's it just matters what kind of art you make and how you talk about your artwork. But man, nothing solidified it more than this experience doing this, because there tends to be a bit of a correlation between people who can orient their art within the art world and have and display the self-awareness in an artist statement with those who have some kind of education, whether, again, that's like a community college, associates in arts sort of thing, a bachelor's, whatever it is, it's correlation. It's not, it's one of the things that you learn when you go to art school, but it's not exclusive to art graduates. And you can also point to plenty of artists who are successful, who are self-taught, who are making it in the art world, who are getting shows, who are working and doing fantastic things with their artwork, who don't have formal arts education. Which brings me sort of to the point of self-taught versus, taught traditionally in an institution. And I think this just reflects everything I was just speaking to, which is I think the lines between those things are blurring a little bit. I learned a lot of my traditional representational painting in school because that was the function of my undergraduate program. But I've also taken workshops with Zoe Frank, Felicia Forte, Hollis Dunlap, Nicholas Arubi, Mia Bergeron, some of these like giants in kind of the painter corner of the art world. And I have learned so much from them. I feel like I've had a continuing arts education. I will also, on a side note, say that relative to the amount of information you get, like, so worth it. I'm like the biggest fan of taking those classes, especially if you're someone who feels insecure about not having formal arts education. Just from those classes alone, I learned probably about as much as I did in my undergraduate from taking these workshops. And so, to call myself sort of traditionally taught, like, that's fair. That gives people some insight into who I am, I suppose, but it doesn't really do a good job painting the full picture of all of the education I've got. I've also learned an enormous amount from, again, social media. I have heard people call it community taught, and I personally love that. Yes, you're self-guiding your education, but I was also to some degree doing that in undergrad. My painting professor had us learn representational painting our first 3 semesters. Our first 2 semesters were just like, you're painting still lifes. It's all about representation. So boring, but fun, but very to the point. Semester 3 was about master studies. We started tiptoeing into style and brushwork, etc. But all of our remaining semesters, you could have gone straight into abstract and conceptual, painting. It could have gotten pretty far away from representational painting, and you would have done great and you would have been fine. And so there already was the framework for sort of self-guided with, obviously supervision, arts education already there. I sort of continue that into my adult life. I continue to sort of say, well, where are the relevant skills? What am I trying to do? What am I trying to communicate? And use that as sort of a lead for my own development. And so here I sit 10 years, almost exactly, as I'm filming this actually, from when I graduated with my undergrad. And it feels like it doesn't fully paint the picture if I say that I just learned from a traditional arts institute, because it doesn't reflect all of the education that I've put in the last decade. So I would consider myself a mixture of community taught. Now, filling out an application, I suppose I would, say that I have a BFA and that's sort of my arts education. But yeah, it doesn't paint the full picture. And so if you're someone who feels self-taught and that feels like maybe doesn't fully explain who you are, it's too associated to sort of this in-group, out-group, insider art, outsider art sort of mentality, call yourself community taught. Say that you have led your own arts education, especially if you've put in the work, effort, and taken the classes to sort of reflect that. Which brings me to my last point on today's episode, which is like, why do I teach representationally? Why is that where my passion is? Because, if you followed me, if you've heard me talk about my philosophy around art, you know that I don't think to be able to paint representationally means that you're better or worse as an artist. Art is about communicating with visual language. Period. Enough said, right? When Duchamp put the ready-made urinal on a white column in the context of an art gallery, he was having a conversation. There was no skill involved. And, within the canon of Western art, that was relevant, that was important, and it sort of broke open the floodgates to say that you could make and say anything with your artwork, right? And I very much believe in that. And I also had a painting professor who said the same thing. But his whole thing was like, but you're going to learn these skills so that you can learn how to break the rules. And I very much believe that too. And when I started making Not Sorry Art School years ago, I started teaching workshops years ago, it started out, full honesty, people wanted to paint like me. And then I was like, I'll teach a workshop and I know how to paint like me, so I'll just teach how to paint. But as I worked more in that industry and did that more, I became very intentional with like, no, I'm going to teach representational. Because the thing is, anytime you teach a workshop, you end up starting to say things like should and rules and don't do this and do that and use black. And I found myself, ever the fan of nuance, really struggling with that because, yes, while I think it is a good general rule to, when you're learning how to mix color, maybe don't use black as a way to navigate how dark or how light your colors are, sure. But I also found having people say, well, I know a good exception to that, drove me nuts. I really wanted to be able to, for myself, even just orient myself, well, what am I doing? What is my goal? Like, why learn to teach like this? Why learn to paint like this? What is the Sari? What am I trying to do to help my students, right? It really kind of got me spinning. And what I ended up coming out the other end with is, listen, I'm going to teach you how to paint representationally in sort of this contemporary spin on like the Boston School, which is like a continuation of Singer Sargent. Basically, it's this idea that if abstract expressionism hadn't sent art very, very non-representational, what would realism have looked like if it had continued going where it was going? Anyways, so that's kind of where I'm at. I orient myself. I say, this is what I'm teaching. It's not the way to learn to paint. It's not the only way. Representational isn't better. It's just a way of painting. And the reason why I've grown to really like that in a world where the older I get, the more I'm like, I have so much respect for people who do not paint representationally. And I understand how much skill that has. It's because it comes back to people's insecurity around their arts education. One of the things I found very quickly when I started my online art program was a large number of my students were people who had taken time and energy to get an undergraduate degree, and they learned how to write good art statements and make good conceptual art and appreciate art and media literacy, but there was never any emphasis on painting representationally. So some programs are very like illustrative. They'll teach you, think of some of the feeder schools that feed into like Disney and Pixar. Now it's more animation, but it's a lot of illustrative work and learning how to paint the form and, building clay sculptures of the muscles and bones and tendons from scratch so that you can fully understand anatomy, so that you can paint very representationally and you can like think in body forms. It's that very, very traditional, lots of rote painting representationally, so that maybe you can go on and use those skills to be an illustrator or an animator or a designer or certainly a painter and paint very representationally. Then there tends to be kind of another camp, and there's plenty of gray in between, but there tends to be another camp of people who are like, if you want to paint that way, then you can figure it out. That's fine. Do your journey. We're going to show you how to write an artist statement, how to orient yourself within the art world, and how to express yourself. And that's it. And I find that people who tend to go to the latter program feel a little bit confined. Let's say they are painting very conceptual sort of work right out of college and they love it and it's great, but then they turn and they do all of a sudden need to paint representationally to get an idea across. They want to start having these abstract forms, or they want to have figures in there, but they never learn that skill. All of a sudden, getting back to the beginning, there's an insecurity there. Well, I went to art school. I'm in this debt. I've got, this art education. I'm working part-time, full-time, whatever, some capacity as an artist. But I feel too insecure to pivot, and I never learned how to paint representationally. So a big part of what I was teaching ended up really resonating with those people, because I position it less as this is the way to paint or this is the Sari way to paint, and more like here's how to paint representationally. Use it at your own will. And likewise, a lot of what I teach is when people think, oh, I have to go to art school, I'm going to learn how to paint really well, which is I think what most people think when you think you're going to go to art school, you're going to learn how to paint. Obviously, like I just said, not always the case. But I wanted to be able to offer people the security of like, well, what am I missing if I'm not going to art school? And if they think that part of what they're missing is the ability to paint representationally, I'm going to offer it to you within the same context and framework that it was offered to me, which is here is a skill, a tool at your disposal, and here's how you can plug it into your own concepts, ideas, and what you're ultimately trying to communicate with your artwork. And it's because of that I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that teaching. And I think it ends up attracting a lot of people who take my retreats and workshops and online art school who are really trying to position themselves in the art world. They have something to say. They want to say something. They want to find their style, and they want to have all the tools and skills to be able to paint representationally at their disposal. But ultimately, they want to say something with their artwork, whether they know what they're saying now and they're just acquiring the skills to do so, or they're still searching on what they want to say. It really runs the gamut. All this to say, this episode is very much about, no, you don't need to have a formal arts education per se to be an artist, but it really ties into sort of the core philosophy that I have around teaching and education. So I'm really hoping that some of that was helpful to you guys. And I want you to walk away from this episode kind of knowing what you're missing out on. I'm very last thing I'll say about this is I was so lucky to get to go to college. I'm sure some of you already are familiar with my story, but I grew up below the poverty line, family of 5. We were raised on anywhere between $11,000 and $14,000 a year off my mom's income, working at a warehouse. And college was really not super in the cards for me. I think at best I thought maybe I could, through my volunteering, get 2 years of community college, which by the way is great and smart, and probably gonna have my kids go that way. At best. And I was a runner because it was part of how I coped with a very abusive home life. And I went and I would run, and I became pretty good at it, and I love with it. And I really lucked into getting a Division II full scholarship on my running abilities. The school that offered me the money, the only one pretty much, I happened to have a painting professor who had an incredible approach to art and his philosophy behind it. And it's the fact that it is for anyone, and that you can get out of it what you put into it. And if you put in effort, and if you put in heart, and if you're dedicated to learning how to communicate with visual language, you can be an artist. And it was exactly everything I needed to hear right when I needed to hear it, in a way that it feels too lucky for me to not do something with and to share that with you guys. And so I hope this resonated with someone. I hope someone walks away from this feeling a little more clear on maybe what it is they're missing out on, or maybe they did get a degree and they're wondering what everyone else learned in their program, or, you want to be an artist, but you're afraid to take that first, push into investing in yourself, because it is really scary. I hope that this episode is comforting. And, if you have any questions, if this made you have more questions, I think that's a good thing. Feel free to reach out to me, and I can either expand on further episodes or answer you personally. I always try to answer emails and direct messages, especially from y'all who listen to these entire episodes. But yeah, you're an artist if you say you're an artist. And hopefully after this episode, you feel more empowered that that's not just a hollow platitude, but that art is for everyone. And the very, very last thing I'll say is, I always, whenever I teach, I open with this statement. I love this statement. And it's this little adage I heard. I wish I remembered where I heard it from. If you know, let me know. But this is painting professor who, he teaches at a college level. And he's sitting down with a 5-year-old girl, and she's coloring and drawing. And, she asks, well, what do you do for work or for a living or whatever? And he says, oh, I teach grownups how to paint and draw. And she says, oh, people forget. And I love that. I love that so much, because to be able to make, to be able to color, draw, paint, whatever, is to be human, is to express ourselves, is to make marks, is to show in a way that feels like a record that we were here and we existed. And I think that that's special. And if I am doing the work of reconnecting people to that primal human urge to make art, to communicate with visuals, to make, then in this crazy chaotic world where, it's hard, it's just hard. Feeling like I'm making a positive difference in that arena provides me so much comfort. And so I'm hoping that provides you guys some comfort. And I hope you feel really empowered, and that art is for you, because it absolutely is. So all that to say, thank you. Thank you for listening. Go make something. Happy creating. Take care. And I'll talk to you guys next week. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for being here. I wanted to also encourage you guys to leave a review. The feedback is incredibly helpful. And if you leave a review, I will read your handle or your name on the following week's episode. Take care, y'all, and happy creating.